The smaller boy stopped crying 11 minutes ago. That was the detail that cut deepest. Not the snow. Not the crowd. Not the way people stepped around the bench like it was a piece of broken furniture left on the curb. It was the quiet. Zion's breathing had gone from ragged to shallow. His lips, chapped, pale at the edges, barely moved. His tiny body had stopped shivering against Kale's chest. And that was worse. So much worse. Because shivering meant fighting. Stillness meant something else entirely. Kale pulled him closer. He didn't speak. He never could anymore. But his arms did what his voice couldn't. They pressed tighter, angled his body forward to cut the wind, positioned his chest like a wall between his sons and the cold that was steadily, patiently winning. The older boy, Amari, gripped Kale's sleeve with both hands. His fingers were stiff, nearly purple at the knuckles. He wasn't crying either. He'd learned early that crying didn't bring anyone. So he just held on, jaw clenched, eyes dry and too old for his face. The way children learn to be quiet when quiet is the only language adults respond to. Around them, the park moved. People walked dogs. Couples held coffee cups in gloved hands, steam curling into the gray winter air. A group of teenagers cut across the path, laughing loud, their voices slapping against the cold and bouncing away. Nobody stopped. Two women in matching puffer coats slowed near the bench. One of them glanced at the boys. Her eyes moved just a fraction to Kale's face, to the bruising along his jaw, to the thin, soaked coat stretched over three bodies like it was trying and failing. Her expression shifted, not to pity, to something colder than the temperature. "Omega," she said to her friend, low but not low enough. "Unregistered, probably. Shouldn't be out here with children." Her friend nodded once. And they kept walking. Hi viewers. Have you ever been in a moment where you needed just one person to stop, and nobody did? Kale didn't watch them go. He already knew. He'd learned that particular silence. The one people put on like a coat before walking past someone dying in plain sight. He'd felt it so many times it had its own texture now. Smooth, practiced, comfortable for everyone except the one being stepped around. He shifted Zion's weight slightly, pressed two fingers to the child's neck. The pulse was there, barely, too slow, too soft, the kind of pulse that had a deadline attached to it. Amari looked up at him. No words, just a question in his eyes. The kind of question a 6-year-old should never have to ask his father. Kale answered the only way he could. He held tighter. Snow gathered in his hair, melted against the bruise on his cheek. His coat, soaked through an hour ago, offered nothing now except the illusion of protection. His hands were going numb. He noticed that the way you notice a door closing at the end of a long hallway. Distant, inevitable. The park noise continued around him. Normal lives. Normal afternoons. He wondered, not for the first time, what it felt like to be invisible on purpose, to choose it instead of having it chosen for you. A dog barked somewhere behind him. A child laughed near the fountain. Zion's chest rose, fell, rose again. Slower this time. Kale pressed his lips to the top of the boy's head. Not a kiss. Not comfort. Just contact. Just, "I'm still here. Stay." Amari tugged his sleeve once. Kale looked down. The boy wasn't pointing at anything. Wasn't saying anything. He was just looking up at his father with that expression. The one that said he knew something was very wrong, and he was choosing to trust Kale anyway, and that trust was the most devastating thing Kale had felt all day. He looked back out at the park. He needed help. He knew that. Knowing it and being able to get it were two separate countries with no road between them. Then the air changed. It didn't get warmer. It didn't get quieter. If anything, the ambient noise of the park continued exactly as before. The dogs, the voices, the crunch of footsteps through packed snow. But something shifted. The way air shifts before a storm that hasn't announced itself yet. Kale's eyes moved to the far edge of the path. 3 figures. Long black coats. Moving in a line that wasn't quite walking. It was something steadier than that, something with a different center of gravity. The snow fell around them and seemed almost reluctant to settle on their shoulders. People moved. Not dramatically. Not with any obvious awareness of why. They just drifted to the sides of the path. The way water moves around stone. Cale didn't look away. He should have. He didn't. The 3 men were identical at a distance. Same height, same build, same unhurried precision in every step. But as they moved closer, the differences appeared, the way differences always do when you stay still long enough to look. One was scanning, eyes moving across the park like he was reading a map only he could see. One was watching the bench. The third was watching Cale. Not the children. Him. Cale's arms locked around Zion instinctively. The 3 men stopped. 10 feet away. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. And Zion's breathing, already dangerously shallow, hitched once. Then went very, very quiet. The one in the center crouched. No warning. No words first. He just lowered himself to eye level with the bench, slow and deliberate, like a man who had never once moved without intention. His eyes were dark. Not hard, that wasn't the right word. More like settled. The way deep water looks settled. Still on the surface. Holding things underneath. He looked at Cale. Not the way people had been looking at Cale all afternoon. Through him, past him, at the inconvenience of him. He looked at him. Cale's jaw tightened. He'd learned to read attention the way some people read weather. Quick glances meant nothing. Lingering looks meant preparation. But this was something outside his existing categories, and that fact alone made his pulse spike in a way the cold hadn't managed. He didn't look away. Neither did the man crouching in front of him. Behind the crouching figure, the other 2 had separated. Not far. 3 feet to the left, 2 feet to the right. A formation that looked casual and wasn't. The one on the left was watching the crowd. Specifically, Cale noticed the way the man's attention moved from face to face without dwelling on any one person. Quick, systematic, like a security sweep. The one on the right hadn't moved at all. He was looking at Zion. Not with softness. Not with horror. With the particular focus of someone taking measurements. The younger one, he said. Flat. Precise. Like stating a coordinate. The man in the center didn't break eye contact with Cale. I know, he said. His voice was low. Not gentle, that wasn't the word either. It was controlled. The kind of controlled that comes from practice, not nature. From choosing over and over to keep something in. How long has he been like this? Cale said nothing. Not because he was choosing silence. Because he had no other option. His voice, the mechanism of it, the ability was gone. Had been for years. What remained was expression, posture, the language of someone who'd had to become fluent in everything except spoken words. The man read him. Fast. You can't answer, he said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't pity either. Just information, filed and moved past in one beat. He looked at Zion then. Properly. The boy's color was wrong. That particular gray-white that skin takes when warmth is running out. The shallow chest movement. The stillness that had replaced shivering. The man pressed 2 fingers to the child's throat. Cale's arms locked. The man didn't pull back. But he didn't push either. He held position. Fingers hovering just at the edge of contact and waited. Waited. Most people, when resisted, pushed harder or pulled away. He did neither. He just waited. Cale's arms slowly, not fully, not willingly, loosened half an inch. The man pressed his fingers to Zion's pulse point. 3 seconds. His expression didn't change, but something behind it did. Something moved in his eyes, quick, gone before it fully arrived. He withdrew his hand, stood up, turned to the man on his right and said nothing. The man on his right was already moving. His coat was off in 4 seconds. A long, heavy thing lined and warm, and he wrapped it around both boys in a single motion, unhurried, efficient. Amari went rigid. His grip on Kale's sleeve tightened to white-knuckled. The man in the center looked at Kale again. "We're not taking them from you," he said. Then, after a pause, "We're moving all 3 of you." Kale's eyes went to the man on his left, the one who'd been watching the crowd. The park had gone quiet, not silent. The sounds were all still there. The wind, the distant voices, somewhere a child still laughing near the fountain. But the people nearby had stopped. Phones were lowered. Conversations trailed off mid-sentence. Nobody was filming. Nobody was approaching. They were just still, like they'd collectively decided that this particular patch of ground wasn't somewhere they wanted their attention anymore. Kale had never seen a crowd do that before without loud voices or visible force. The man in the center reached into his coat, pulled out a phone, said 4 words into it. "Bring the car up." He looked at Kale. "Your boys need warmth and a doctor." In that order. A pause. "You need both too, but I'm guessing you'll fight me on that part." He wasn't wrong. Kale's eyes moved between the 3 men, reading, calculating, looking for the angle, the price, the catch, the thing that would flip this into something familiar and dangerous. He found nothing obvious. That didn't make him feel better. The man on the left tilted his head slightly, still not looking directly at Kale. He was still scanning the edges of the park. "His suppression is off," he said. The man in the center's focus sharpened almost imperceptibly. "By how much?" "Enough." A pause. "Someone with decent range would catch it." The man in the center looked back at Kale. His expression was neutral, but his eyes were doing the thing again, moving quickly behind the stillness, cataloging, filing. "How long since you last had suppressants?" Kale looked away. The man nodded once. "That answers that." Behind them, a black vehicle had appeared at the park's edge. No horn, no flashers. It simply arrived the way these men moved, quiet, certain, already decided. The man in the center looked at Kale one more time. "I'll carry the younger one," he said. "You carry the other. That way your hands stay on your children the entire time." It was the most strategic thing anyone had ever said to Kale, because it was also the thing most likely to work. Kale's chest tightened. He looked at Zion, at the 2 pale lips, the chest that was barely rising now. Then at Amari, who was still holding his sleeve, still trusting, still waiting for Kale to decide. The man in the center extended both hands, palm up, open, no force in them, and waited. The house was the wrong kind of warm, not wrong temperature. The heat worked fine, pumped evenly through wide rooms with high ceilings and dark wood floors that didn't creak. Wrong the way a hospital is warm, controlled, deliberate. The kind of warmth that had been decided on rather than accumulated. Kale stood in the entrance hallway and didn't move past the threshold. He was still holding Amari. The boy's face was buried in his father's neck. He hadn't looked up since the car. His hands, still stiff from cold, had found the back of Kale's collar and stayed there. Across the hallway, through a doorway that led into what looked like a sitting room, the man with dark eyes, the one who had crouched at the bench, was handing Zion to a woman in a white uniform. She moved fast. No wasted motion. She was speaking low and quick to someone Kale couldn't see. Kale took 3 steps forward before he stopped himself. The man noticed. "She's a doctor," he said without turning around. "Pediatric. She's been waiting." Waiting. Kale caught on that word. Turned it over. They called ahead. Before the car arrived. Before the decision was fully made on Kale's side, these men had already set something in motion. He filed that away. The man in the center, Kale had started thinking of him that way, the center one, because he seemed to be the hinge everything else pivoted around, finally turned to look at him. "Zion," he said. "The younger one. That's his name." Kale stared. Amari told us in the car, the man said. Matter of fact. The older one talks. He said it without judgment, without the particular awkward pause people usually inserted when noting that Kale didn't. It was just information. Context. Kale gave a single nod. The man looked at him for a moment. Then, you can go in. She won't work on him without you in the room unless you choose to step out. Kale was moving before the sentence finished. The sitting room had been cleared. Not messily. Everything that had been furniture and decoration was simply gone, replaced by a portable examination unit and a rack of medical equipment that looked more expensive than anything Kale had seen outside of a hospital. 2 people assisted the doctor. Nobody spoke to Kale. Nobody asked him to leave. He stood at the edge of the room with Amari still on his hip and watched everything. Every instrument they used. Every exchange between the doctor and her assistants. The 4-line going in slow, careful. The warming blanket, the vitals monitor, the precise and unhurried competence of people who had done this before and knew what they were doing. Zion's color started coming back 20 minutes in. Barely. A hint of pink at the ears first, then the cheeks. Kale exhaled. He hadn't realized he'd been holding it. Amari pulled back from his neck far enough to look at his brother. He studied the monitors, the wires, the 4-line, all of it, with the same expression Kale had seen on his face in the park. Serious. Processing. Is he gonna be okay? He asked. Not loud. Not to anyone in particular. The doctor looked up. Yes, she said. Simple. Direct. He needs fluids and rest and heat. He's going to be fine. Amari looked at his father. Kale nodded once. The boy put his face back against Kale's neck. 2 hours later, Zion was asleep in a room upstairs. An actual bed, an actual room with a monitor attached and the doctor 2 doors down. Amari had lasted another 40 minutes before going out mid-sentence. Sprawled across a couch with his shoes still on. Kale had not sat down. He stood in the hallway outside the room where his sons were sleeping and stared at the wall. The house had settled into quiet. The staff he'd counted for maybe 5 had moved to other parts of the building. The doctor had given him a nod on her way past that meant resting, stable, not critical anymore. He let that settle. Then he started looking at the house the way he looked at everything. Where the exits were. How the windows sat, floor to ceiling in the main rooms, latched from inside. The front door had a keypad. The door at the end of the hall had one too. He walked to it. Pressed the handle. Locked. He stood there for a moment. Then heard footsteps. Unhurried. Already familiar in their rhythm. The center one appeared at the end of the hallway. Jacket off now. Sleeves rolled to the elbow. He was holding 2 glasses of water. He held one out. Kale didn't take it. The man set both on the small table by the wall. The door locks from this side at night, he said, looking at the door Kale had just tried. Staff can't access the residential wing after 10. Security measure. A pause. Not a trap. Kale looked at him. The code is 4 digits. The man continued. I'll give it to you in the morning. Tonight you'd probably just run, and your younger son is in no condition to be moved. It was the most honest thing a person had said to Kale in years. He hated how much that meant. He picked up the glass of water. Drank half of it standing up, still watching the man. The man watched him back. Not with the careful attention of someone trying to gain trust. With the straightforward attention of someone who didn't need to pretend. You haven't eaten since before the park, the man said. Kale said nothing. There's food in the kitchen. Staff left plates. A pause. You can eat first and bring your son's plates in the morning, or you can wait and eat with them. Either works. He said it without pressure. Without the specific tone people used when they were offering something and waiting for gratitude. Kale set the glass down. Turned toward the room where his sons were sleeping. The man didn't call after him. Didn't say anything else. Kale stopped at the doorway. Looked in at the 2 sleeping shapes. The rise and fall of Zion's chest. Steady now, real now. He looked back at the hall. The man was gone, but both glasses of water were still on the table. And next to them a plate, covered, quietly left. Kale stared at it for a long moment. Then he walked back, picked it up, and carried it into the room with his sons. He sat on the floor between the two beds and ate. If someone helped you without asking for anything in return, would you trust them, or would that make you more suspicious? 3 days passed, then 4, then 7. Nothing happened. That was what made it impossible to settle. Not the house. The house was quiet and warm and more ordered than any place Kale had ever stayed. Not the staff, they were efficient, moved around the edges of his presence without speaking to him unless he was directly in their path. Not the food, appearing 3 times a day like it had always been appearing, like consistency was just a thing that existed in the world without effort. What made it impossible was the alphas, because they were there constantly, somewhere in the building, moving through the same halls, breathing the same air, and they did nothing. No questions, no demands, no explanations. They watched. That was all. The center one, Kale had eventually heard a staff member use his name, Drayden, would appear at intervals throughout the day with no apparent pattern. A doorway, the end of a hall, the kitchen counter, leaning against it with a coffee mug, watching Kale move through the space with the same focused stillness he'd had in the park. Not aggressive, not predatory in any obvious way, just attentive. The second, the one who had scanned the park crowd, was named Cashin. He was the quietest of the 3. Kale spotted him twice a day at most. But every time he appeared, Kale had the specific sensation of being cataloged from a distance. Measurements being taken. Data points filed. The third was Romulo. He was the one who noticed the children first. Not in a concerning way. In a precise way. He watched Amari with the focused attention of someone running analysis, noting the way the boy ate, how much, in what order. Watched how Zion moved post-recovery, whether his left hand trembled still, how long it took him to cross a room. None of it was warm. All of it was accurate, which made it, somehow, harder to dismiss. Kale tracked all 3 of them the way he tracked weather. Not obsessively but constantly in the background because weather could turn. On the 8th day he noticed the pattern. He always ate last. He hadn't decided to. It was automatic. Put the boys' plates down first, check that they were eating, watch that Zion finished. By the time his own food was in front of him, the boys were done, staff had cleared the table, and Kale ate alone in a kitchen that had gone quiet. On the 4th day, he caught Drayden watching that sequence from the doorway. No comment, no expression change, just watching. On the 7th day, Cashin was there instead. On the 8th, Romulo. They were taking turns. Kale sat with that for a long time. On day 9, Drayden stopped in the kitchen doorway and didn't leave. Kale looked up from Amari's plate, which he was cutting, the boy's hands still stiff some mornings, and met his eyes. "You ate 4 hours ago," Drayden said. "Breakfast." Kale looked back at the plate. "You've done this every meal since you arrived." He wasn't asking a question. He was stating something he'd already confirmed, from 3 angles over 8 days. Kale cut the last piece on Amari's plate, set down the knife, didn't respond. Drayden was quiet for a moment. Then, "The boys get fed regardless of whether you eat first. Staff would make sure of that." Kale looked at him then, long enough for Drayden to understand what that look meant. That regardless was a word Kale had learned not to trust. That would was a word that required proof. That there was no version of history Kale was carrying that allowed him to take that sentence at face value. Drayden held his gaze, didn't argue, didn't backtrack, just looked at him the way someone looks at a problem they've decided to be patient with. "All right," he said, and left. It was Amari who almost unraveled everything on day 11. The boy had woken early, found Kale asleep on the floor between the beds. A habit Kale couldn't break, and instead of waking him, had wandered out into the hallway. Kale woke to Amari's absence the way he always woke to it. Instantly. Zero transition between sleep and upright. He found the boy at the end of the corridor, sitting on the floor across from Romulo, who was also sitting on the floor, back against the wall, apparently working on something on a tablet. Amari was talking. He talked the way only a child who hadn't had enough real conversation in years could talk. All at once, without structure, jumping between observations and questions and half-finished thoughts. And Zion used to cry more, but he stopped, I don't know when. And my dad can't talk, but he makes this sound sometimes when we're really cold. That means it's okay. And I don't have a coat anymore. Mine got left somewhere. And do you have cereal here? Because Romulo looked up from the tablet. Yes, he said, to the cereal question. Second cabinet from the left. Which left? Standing at the sink, looking out. Amari considered that. Do you have the kind with the shapes? I'll have it by tomorrow. Amari looked at him for a moment. You're not gonna ask me stuff? Not right now, Romulo said. My dad says people who ask a lot of questions right away usually want something. Romulo looked at him. He's not wrong, he said. Amari turned that over in his head, then stood up and headed toward the kitchen, apparently satisfied. Romulo looked up at the end of the hallway, where Kale was standing. He'd been there long enough to hear all of it. Romulo held the eye contact for a moment, then looked back at his tablet. Kale stood there a moment longer than he meant to, then went to find his son. That afternoon, Kale was passing the main study when he heard all three of them inside. Not loudly, they weren't arguing, nothing like that, but something in the tone pulled his attention. He stopped outside the door. Suppression is at about 40%, Cashin's voice measured. Without consistent intake, that's dropping. If he's in public, he knows, Drayden. Does he know that he's broadcasting? Silence. He knows something is off, Drayden said. Whether he knows the specific radius. Someone picked it up at the park. That's not coincidence. That's someone looking. Another silence. Longer. Then Romulo. The boys. Clean. No markers. Then it's just him. Yes. Kale stood in the hallway and didn't move. His heart was doing something specific and controlled in his chest. Not panic. Kale had lived past the point where panic was still useful. This was colder than that. More tactical. Someone had noticed him at the park. Not these three. Someone else. And these three knew, and had not told him. He walked away from the door before he heard anything else. Walked back to his son's room. Sat on the floor between the two beds. Zion was asleep, color fully back now, breathing even. Amari was building something out of the small wooden blocks that had appeared in the room 3 days ago without anyone mentioning them. Kale sat there and thought about what preparing meant to men who had resources like this, and about what it meant that they'd started whatever this was before he'd agreed to anything. Amari looked up. Dad, he said, do you think they're the good kind or the other kind? Kale looked at his son for a long moment. He didn't have an answer yet. That was the most honest thing he could give. At what point does protection cross the line into something you didn't agree to? The children laughed on day 14. Not small, not cautious, loud and sudden, the kind that fills a room and doesn't ask permission. It came from the kitchen, where Amari had apparently convinced Romulo to do something involving the cereal and a measuring cup, the details of which Kale never fully understood. He was in the hallway when it happened, just passing, just moving between rooms, and the sound hit him like a physical thing. He stopped walking, stood there, listened, then kept moving. But something in him didn't. That was the beginning of the dangerous part. It happened in small pieces after that. Zion started crossing the room without hesitating at doorways. He developed the habit, somewhere in the months before the park, of stopping at every threshold and checking before he went through. He stopped doing that around day 16. Kale noticed it before he noticed anything else. Amari started eating all the food on his plate. He used to leave the last few bites. Old habit, a specific kind of rationing that children develop when they're not sure when the next plate comes. He stopped doing that on day 18. Kale noticed every single change. Filed it. Didn't know what to do with any of it. The alphas maintained their distance. No dramatic shifts. No sudden closeness or declaration. They were just present, consistent, quiet, observing, and Kale kept waiting for the change in pattern that never came. On day 20, he stopped checking all the window latches before bed. He didn't decide to stop. He just realized, standing at the second window in the hall, that his hand was already dropping without completing the check. Like some part of him had quietly, without permission, started calculating differently. He finished the check anyway, but the fact that he'd almost skipped it stayed with him all night. It was Drayden who found him on the roof. Not the roof exactly. A wide terrace off the 3rd floor that opened through a glass door nobody had locked or mentioned. Kale had found it on day 4, confirmed it on day 7, started using it on day 12 when the walls of the house started feeling like a different kind of cold than outside. He was sitting on the low stone barrier, coat on, watching the city lights below, not planning anything, just breathing. Drayden came through the glass door without knocking, no door to knock on, and stopped when he saw where Kale was sitting. Something shifted in his expression. Fast. Gone. He didn't say move back or be careful or any of the hovering things people said. He just walked to the wall, a few feet away, and stood there. Neither of them spoke. The city noise came up from below, distant, continuous, the specific blur of a city at night that is somehow both loud and quiet at once. Amari asked me today if he'd have to leave, Drayden said eventually. Kale looked at him. I told him I didn't know. A pause. I thought you should know I said that. Instead of something easier. Kale held his gaze for a moment, then looked back out at the city. Cashin wants to start discussions about longer arrangements, Drayden continued. Not tonight. Just soon. Another pause. I wanted you to hear it from me before it became a conversation in a room where you felt cornered. Kale was quiet. You don't have to respond right now, Drayden said. You're not required to respond at all tonight. That was the thing. That specific construction. Not required hit differently than Kale expected. He'd been required his entire life. Required to be quiet. Required to be grateful. Required to disappear from spaces he made people uncomfortable in. Required to explain and justify and minimize. Not required was a small phrase. It had significant weight. He exhaled, sat there for another moment, then swung his legs back over the stone barrier and stood. He didn't look at Drayden again before going back inside. But in the doorway he stopped. Just for a second. Didn't turn around. Drayden didn't say anything. Kale went inside. Day 23. Zion said his father's name in his sleep. Clearly. Comfortably. Not crying it. Just saying it the way children say things in dreams that make you understand they're somewhere safe. Kale, on the floor between the beds, heard it. He sat with it for a long time in the dark. Something settled in his chest that had been refusing to settle for weeks. Not trust. Not yet. Something smaller than that, a single specific weight going still. He thought about what Drayden had said about longer arrangements. He thought about Amari's question, the good kind or the other kind, and the fact that he still didn't have a full answer. He thought about Zion's color coming back and the wooden blocks and the shape cereal and the second window latch he'd almost not checked. He thought about the conversation he'd heard through the study door. Someone had noticed him at the park. Not these three. Someone looking. And the triplets had gone quiet on the subject since. Hadn't brought it up. Hadn't explained. Whatever longer arrangements meant, it was connected to that. He was certain of it. He lay back on the floor between his sons. closed his eyes. And then, before he could finish the thought, he heard it. The front door. Downstairs. Not forceful. Not alarmed. But at 4 in the morning. With the building locked, with keypad access on every entry point, Cale knew the sound of that door. He'd memorized it in the first 3 days. It didn't open by accident. And when he heard Drayden's voice below, low, clipped, nothing like the measured tone he used during the day, something shifted in the air of the house. Something that had nothing to do with warmth or stability or careful distance. He sat up, listened, and heard, underneath the muffled exchange downstairs, a single phrase in Cashin's voice, clear enough to carry. They moved faster than we expected. The wooden floor of the hallway, 30 seconds later, gave a single creak, then went silent. Do you think Cale made the right call staying? Or was he already walking into something he couldn't walk back from? The front door was locked by morning. Not the way it locked every night. Keypad engaged, staff cleared, building sealed. This was different. The whole ground floor felt different. Tighter. Like the air pressure had shifted and nobody was going to explain why. Cale stood at the top of the stairs and listened. He'd been doing that since 4 in the morning. Since the door, since Cashin's voice carrying up through the floor, since the words they moved faster than we expected settled somewhere behind his sternum and refused to leave. Now it was 7, and the house felt like a held breath. Amari appeared in the doorway behind him, hair pressed flat on one side, still half asleep. Is breakfast ready? Cale turned, looked at his son, nodded once. They went downstairs together. The kitchen was warm. Food was on the counter, covered plates, orange juice, the shape cereal Romolo had made good on. Staff had been through already. The house ran on precision even when everything else didn't. Cale stood at the counter and watched the kitchen door while his sons ate. Zion was eating with both hands this morning. Cale noticed that. Filed it. Both hands, no hesitation. Reaching for the spoon and the cup at the same time, the way a child does when they're not thinking about food anymore. When having it has started to feel regular. That observation sat in Cale's chest with very specific weight. He heard footsteps in the hall. Cashin appeared first. He poured coffee without looking at Cale. Set the cup down. Stood at the counter with his back half turned. The way someone stands when they're choosing their words. That was new. Cashin didn't usually choose his words. He just stated things. We'll need to have a conversation today, Cashin said. Not to the room. To Cale specifically. Cale waited. This afternoon. All 3 of us and you. A pause. Not the children. Zion looked up from his bowl. Amari kept eating but his shoulders changed. Just slightly. The way a child's shoulders change when they're listening to something they weren't meant to. Cale put a hand on Amari's head briefly. The boy's shoulders came back down. Cashin looked at both kids for a moment. Something in his expression shifted, too fast to catch fully, and then went neutral again. 2 o'clock, he said, and left. Cale stood in the kitchen after that, eating nothing, and thought about the word conversation. The way Cashin had used it. The particular shape of it. Not meeting, not discussion, conversation, like it was being offered as something equal, something you could participate in, not just receive. He didn't trust that framing, but he noticed it. The study felt different with all 3 of them in it. Cale had been in that room before. Passed it, paused outside it, heard things through the door that he wasn't meant to hear. But being inside it, with all 3 of them present, with the door closed and no staff in the hall, was a different experience. Not claustrophobic. Something more organized than that. Drayden sat. Cashin stood. Romolo was by the window, arms crossed, watching the yard. They'd left a chair for Cale. He didn't take it. Stood near the door instead. Drayden noted that and didn't comment. We found you deliberately, he said. 3 words that restructured everything. Cale went very still. Not randomly. Not by chance. Drayden's voice was level. We'd been tracking an unregistered Omega in this district for 6 weeks. Someone put a flag on a suppression irregularity through a secondary registry system. Cashin pulled it. Kale looked at Cashin. Cashin looked back. Didn't apologize. Didn't soften it. You weren't the first name, Cashin said. You were the third. The first two were resolved quickly. You were more complicated. Complicated. Kale thought about what his life looked like from the outside, reduced to a file. A flag. A suppression irregularity in a registry he didn't know existed. He thought about the park. Someone else was tracking the same signal, Romulo said from the window. He turned. We picked up a secondary observer 3 days before we made contact. They weren't ours. Not city registry. Not standard oversight. The room was quiet for a moment. Private, Drayden said. Resourced. Looking specifically for unmated Omegas with no legal documentation. Kale understood what that meant. He'd understood it the second Cashin said they moved faster than we expected. He just hadn't wanted to. We left, Drayden continued, because we needed to confirm the source before we brought you inside that network formally. If we'd claimed you before we knew who was watching, we'd have handed them a direction. A pause. We were gone for 11 days. 11 days. Kale thought about those 11 days. About the weight of the empty house. About Zion asking where the men went and Amari saying I don't know with that practice calm that was actually fear. He thought about how the silence had felt different the second time. Because it had been. Because the first time he hadn't known what safety was yet. His jaw was tight. He could feel it. You made a decision about my safety, he said. Not out loud. He couldn't. But his hands moved, quick, pointed. The specific shorthand he'd developed years ago because silence wasn't the same as having nothing to say. Drayden watched his hands. Then looked up. Yes, he said. He didn't add anything to that. Didn't justify it. Didn't explain the logic further. Just yes, owning it. Kale stood there for a long moment. We're telling you now, Drayden said. Not because we have to. Because you've spent 11 days in this house calculating your exit, and you deserve the actual information instead of the gaps. He paused. The people tracking you aren't done. They lost the signal when we moved you, but they'll pick it up again. He looked at Kale steadily. Which means we need a decision. From you. Real one. Not fear. Not gratitude. A beat. A decision. Kale looked at him. At all three of them. The room was completely quiet. And outside the door, faint and distant, Amari was laughing at something Zion did. That sound hit Kale somewhere behind the ribs. He didn't answer. Not yet. He walked to the door. Opened it. Stopped. Without turning, he held up 2 fingers. Drayden was quiet for a moment. 2 days, he said. Kale walked out. The authorities didn't knock. They never did. That was the thing Kale had learned early. People with the right paperwork didn't knock because knocking implied the possibility of refusal, and refusal was exactly what they'd decided in advance wasn't available to someone like him. The front door panel beeped twice, then went green from an override code. Kale was at the top of the stairs with both boys behind him before the door fully opened. Three city officers. 2 secondary officials in gray, not enforcement documentation. The kind of people you brought when you wanted the removal of something to look procedural rather than forced. Behind them, on the front step, a man Kale had never seen before. Calm face. Expensive coat. Eyes doing the specific calculation of a person who already knew how this was going to end and had shown up to confirm it in person. The lead officer stepped inside without being invited. Unregistered Omega. Designation K. Secondary reference. He glanced at a tablet. Minor children in custody. No legal documentation. No registered guardian. Violation of relocation protocol. His voice was flat, practiced. The voice of a person who'd read the same list many times to many people in many doorways. Kale's hand came back, found Amari's shoulder. The boy didn't move. "Sir, you'll need to step forward and present identification." Kale didn't move. "Sir." He's mute. Drayden's voice, from the top of the stairs, even and unhurried. He walked down past Kale like the 3 officers and 2 officials and 1 stranger in an expensive coat were a minor obstruction in his own hallway. "You'll address concerns to me." The lead officer looked at him, recalibrated. "And you are the registered occupant of this address." Drayden stopped 4 steps from the bottom. "The Omega and the children are guests. If you have documentation concerns, I suggest you consult my legal team, whose contact I'll have sent to your department within the hour." The documentation officials exchanged a look. The man in the expensive coat hadn't moved from the step. Kale was watching him. Not the officers. Not Drayden. Him. The man's eyes moved up past Drayden. Found Kale at the top of the stairs. And something in his expression did the specific thing that expressions do when they've confirmed what they came to confirm. He'd gotten what he wanted just by walking in. He knew Kale was here. Location, confirmed. Condition, confirmed. Situation, mapped. Whatever happened next with the paperwork and the officers was secondary. Kale's chest tightened. "We have a report of unlawful concealment of an unregistered individual," the lead officer said. He was looking at Drayden, but his voice had shifted. Less practiced, more careful. Like he'd started the sentence in a room he thought he understood and finished it in one he didn't. "The children may require." "Touch them," said Romulo. He'd come from the hallway to the left. Not running. Not aggressive. He was standing very still, arms at his sides, voice quieter than his normal register. That was the specific quality of it that stopped the room. Not volume. Absence. "Touch either of those children," Romulo said, "and we'll have a very different conversation." The second documentation official stepped back. The lead officer looked between Romulo and Drayden and made the calculation that trained officials make when they enter situations where the power balance turns out to be nothing like the briefing suggested. "We're still required to verify the children's welfare. They're going to be removed from the premises," said the man in the expensive coat. First time he'd spoken. Clear. Unbothered. Like he was narrating an outcome that had already occurred. Every head in the room turned toward him, including the officers. He stepped inside without being asked. "The Omega is unregistered. The children have no documented guardian. Standard protocol provides for." "Who are you?" Drayden asked. Not aggressive. Not loud. The specific flat quality of a man who knows the answer and is testing whether he'll be told the truth. The man smiled. Not warmly. "Someone who's been waiting a long time for this to be resolved." Upstairs, Amari had gone very still against Kale's side. Zion's hand had found Kale's shirt. Kale looked down at them, at Zion's grip, at Amari's jaw set the way it had been set in the park. Tight and dry-eyed and too old for 6. He looked up. The man in the expensive coat was watching him now with the particular patience of someone who'd run this sequence before. The lead officer was moving toward the stairs. "Sir, I need you to." Kale stepped forward. Amari grabbed his sleeve. "Dad." The officer reached the 3rd step. Kale came down too. And then Cashin, who had not been in the hallway 30 seconds ago, was between them. Just there. Still. Like he'd always been standing in that exact spot and the rest of the world had rearranged itself around him. The officer stopped. Cashin didn't touch him. Didn't threaten. Just stood. "You're going to need a different document," Cashin said. His voice was quiet in the way that rooms go quiet before weather. "What document?" the lead officer asked. Cashin reached into his coat. Held it out. The officer took it. "Read it." His face changed in real time. One line at a time. By the fourth line, he'd stopped reading aloud. By the eighth, he'd turned to the documentation officials with an expression that asked a question nobody in that room wanted to answer out loud. The man in the expensive coat looked at Cashin. For the first time, something moved behind his calm expression. "That's not possible," he said. Cashin looked at him. "It took 8 days to finalize," Cashin said. "We backdated the registration by 11. The lead officer looked up from the document, then at Cale, then at the man in the expensive coat. "Sir," he said slowly, "if this documentation is filed and verified, and I need to confirm that, but if it is, then there's no violation here." "It's not possible," the man said again. His voice was still level, but the specific texture of it had changed. The certainty had gone somewhere. Cashin didn't answer, didn't explain, just stood there with the absolute stillness of someone who'd prepared for exactly this moment while the other side had been preparing for a different one. The lead officer looked at his two colleagues, then at the man in the expensive coat. "We're going to need to step outside and verify," he said. They moved toward the door. The man in the expensive coat didn't move immediately. His eyes went to Cale again, up at the stairs, holding his sons, not speaking, not moving, just looking back. "This isn't over," the man said. He said it quietly, not to Drayden, not to Cashin, to Cale. Then he turned and walked out. The door closed. The hallway went silent. Amari's grip on Cale's sleeve loosened by a fraction. Cale looked at Cashin, at the document he was now refolding, at the 11-day absence and the backdated filing and the thing Cashin had said in the study. They moved faster than we expected, and understood something he hadn't fully understood before. This was not a rescue. It had never been a rescue. It was a countermove, and he and his sons were the position being defended. When someone fights for you without telling you, does that make them an ally, or does it make you their strategy? The house was quiet for exactly 4 minutes after the officers left. Cale counted. Then Drayden walked back into the hallway and said 2 words to Cashin that Cale couldn't hear. Cashin nodded once and went upstairs. Romulo went to the back of the house. Drayden stood in the center of the hallway alone for a moment, facing the closed door. Then he turned, looked up at Cale, said nothing. That was the moment Cale understood that the calm these 3 wore wasn't the absence of urgency. It was the management of it. Something was wrong. Not the officers, they were a symptom. Not the man in the expensive coat. He was a messenger, a confirm and report. What was wrong was behind all of it. Larger. The reason a man with resources had stood in the doorway of a private residence and looked at an unregistered Omega like he was a recovered asset, not a person. Cale took his sons back to their room, sat them on the bed. Amari was watching him with that specific look. The one that asked a question he was old enough to understand didn't have a comfortable answer. Cale looked at him, put a hand on his face. "You're okay." That was what the hand said. Not the situation was not okay. But them. "You're okay." Amari leaned into it for exactly 3 seconds, then sat back. "Are we leaving?" he asked. Cale held his gaze. He didn't know. He signed it. Both hands. "I don't know yet." Amari nodded. Filed it. Accepted the honesty the way he'd learned to accept difficult things, without argument, without drama, with the specific quiet of a child who'd learned that clean information was better than a comfortable lie. Zion had fallen asleep sideways on the bed, one hand still loosely holding the edge of the blanket. Cale stayed until both boys were settled. Then he went looking for Drayden. He found him in the study. Alone this time. No tablet, no files, no work visible. Just standing at the window with his hands loose at his sides, looking out at the yard where snow had started again. Light, consistent, the kind that accumulated without announcing itself. Cale walked in, didn't close the door. Drayden turned, looked at him, then sat down. Not behind the desk, in the chair on the near side, The lower one. The position you choose when you don't want height in a conversation. Kale sat across from him. They held eye contact for a moment. Kale's hands moved. Short, direct. Who was he? Not a question. A requirement. Drayden looked at his hands. Looked at his face. Understood. His name is Warren Holt, he said. He runs a private placement network. Unmated omegas. Specifically ones without documentation, which means no legal recourse, no registry trail, no one looking. He paused. He had your name 4 months before we did. For months. Kale went very still. He wasn't in the park by chance. He'd been tracking your location for weeks. The day we found you, he was 2 days behind us. A pause. If we'd been 2 days slower. He didn't finish that sentence. He didn't need to. Kale thought about the park. About Zion's pulse under his fingers. Too faint. Counting down. About how he'd almost not gone to the park that day, had almost stayed in the shelter instead. 2 days. The document Cashin filed, the backdated registration, Drayden said. It creates legal standing. Makes you a formal resident of this household. Makes the children documented dependents under our address. He looked at Kale steadily. Holt can't file against that. Not without exposing his own operation. It's a shield, Kale signed. His hands moved slower this time. Less urgent. More precise. Yes. Not a claim. Drayden was quiet for a moment. It can be both, he said. That's your choice. The snow outside was coming down heavier now. Kale watched it for a moment. He thought about the conversation in the study 11 days ago. About Cashin's voice at 4 in the morning. About the way Romulo had stood in front of the officers with that specific absence of volume that was somehow louder than a shout. He thought about Amari asking the good kind or the other kind. He thought about Zion's hand on his shirt. You said it was a decision, Kale signed. Mine. Yes. But the document is already filed. It protects you whether you stay or go, Drayden said. It doesn't obligate you. Kale looked at him. Warren Holt said it wasn't over. He was right. He'll come back. Yes. With more than officers next time. Drayden didn't answer immediately. That silence was its own answer. Kale leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and stayed there for a moment. The weight of the week, of the officers and the document and the man in the expensive coat looking at him like a recovered asset, settled across his shoulders. Then he straightened. What does the next move look like? He signed. Drayden looked at him for a moment. Something shifted in his expression. Fast. Not relief, something more specific than relief. Like a door that had been held open finally deciding on its hinge. It means we go public, Drayden said. Not hiding. Not a document in a filing system. Public. He paused. Holt's operation survives on obscurity. His targets are invisible. The moment you're visible, formally, publicly, he loses the angle. Visible how? Kale signed. Drayden looked at him steadily. A formal claim, he said. All 3 of us. Your name on our household registry. The children too. He didn't look away. Everything Holt needs you to not have, you'd have. The room was quiet. Outside the snow was thick now. Steady. The yard had gone white. Kale's hands stayed in his lap. He thought about what visible meant. He thought about what it had cost him. Every time he'd been visible without protection. He thought about what it might mean to be visible with it. Then his hands moved. Slow. Deliberate. Give me tonight, he signed. Drayden nodded. Kale stood. Walked to the door. Stopped. Turned back. His hands moved one more time. Shorter. Just 4 signs. Thank you for the document. He didn't wait for a response. He walked back upstairs. And in the room at the end of the hall, Amari was awake again, watching the door. He'd heard enough to know. Kids always did. Dad, he said, when Kale sat on the floor beside the bed. Are they trying to take us? Cale looked at his son. He didn't lie. He nodded. Amari was quiet for a moment. Then, so what do we do? Cale put his hand over his son's. Held it. And outside, somewhere below, a door closed. Followed by footsteps. 3 sets. All moving in the same direction. Warren Holt's people arrived at 7 the next morning. Not the city. Not officers this time. Private. 4 of them. In a black vehicle that parked at the corner and didn't move for 20 minutes before Cashin flagged it on the building's secondary monitor. He said nothing when he saw it. Just sent a single message to Drayden. Here. By 7:15, the ground floor of the house had changed. Not dramatically. Not visibly from outside. But the staff was gone, cleared, moved, no civilians in the building. Romulo had the boys in the far wing, 3rd floor, door locked. 2 additional people Cale had never seen before were in the building. Arrived through the back, quiet, professional, the kind of professional that didn't need to explain what they were professional at. Cale stood in the main hallway. Drayden came to stand beside him. You don't have to be here for this, he said. Cale didn't move. Go upstairs with your boys. Cale turned and looked at him. Directly. His hands moved. I've been hiding for 4 years. I'm done. Drayden held his gaze. Then nodded once. The front door opened at 7:22. Holt walked in alone. That was interesting. His 4 people stayed at the vehicle, which meant he either didn't consider this a physical confrontation, or he was too confident to need one. Both were possible. Both said something specific about who he thought he was walking in to face. He stopped when he saw Cale. Surprised. Not frightened. Not deterred. But surprised that Cale was standing in the hallway at all. Upright, still, not pressed to the back of a room somewhere. Brave, Holt said. It wasn't a compliment. Cale held his ground. Drayden stepped forward, not in front of Cale. Beside him. The specific distinction of standing with someone rather than shielding them. Cashin appeared from the left hallway. Holt's eyes moved across all 3 of them, then back to Cale. You understand, Holt said, that a registration document filed 12 days ago by a third party doesn't resolve a 4-month precedence record in a private network. It resolves it in every legal record that matters, Cashin said. Private networks aren't interested in legal records. Private networks aren't interested in visibility either, Cashin said. Which is about to become a problem for you. Holt smiled. Small. Controlled. A claim from 3 alphas with no prior social record involving an unregistered omega and 2 undocumented children. He tilted his head. That will raise questions. It already has, Drayden said. Holt looked at him. I sent documentation to 4 separate oversight offices at 6 this morning, Drayden continued. Names, financial records, placement logs, incomplete because we didn't have everything. But enough. He paused. We didn't need to bury your operation. We just needed to make sure that when you moved on this household today, someone was already looking at you. The smile on Holt's face changed. Not gone, but altered. The comfortable certainty behind it had gone somewhere. You leaked your own records, he said. Yours, Drayden said. The ones Cashin's had for 8 days. The room was very quiet. Cale stood in the center of it. Not hiding. Not held. Just there. Present in a way he hadn't been allowed to be present in public in years. Standing in a house that had his name in a file somewhere, with his sons in the wing above him, while 3 men who had found him in the snow stood beside him and let that mean something. Holt looked at him again. Long. Calculating. Then at Drayden. This isn't finished, he said. No, Drayden agreed. But your window closed this morning. Holt was quiet for a moment. Then he turned and walked out. The vehicle at the corner was gone before the front door fully closed. Cashin watched the monitor for 30 seconds. Then, he'll regroup. I know, Drayden said. This buys time. Not resolution. I know that too. Romulo appeared at the top of the stairs with both boys. Amari came down fast. 3 steps, then stopped when he saw Kale's face. Read it. Is it done? Kale opened his hands. For now. Amari looked at Drayden. Did you win? Drayden looked at the boy for a moment. We held, he said. Amari considered that. Is that good? Today it is, Drayden said. Amari seemed to accept that. He sat on the step, chin in his hand, the expression of a child doing adult calculations with the information he'd been given. Zion came down more slowly, stopped beside his father, put his hand in Kale's without looking up. Kale looked down at him, then picked him up, held him. Zion put both arms around his father's neck and stayed there. Drayden watched, didn't look away. And then, because Kale was already holding Zion and Amari was on the step 3 feet away, Drayden walked to the step and sat down beside Amari. Not saying anything, not doing anything, just present. Amari looked at him sideways. You're sitting on the stairs, he said. I know, Drayden said. Why? Drayden thought about it for a second. Seemed like the right place to be, he said. Amari looked at him for another moment, then leaned sideways. Just slightly, just enough for his shoulder to press against Drayden's arm. The hallway went quiet. Outside, the snow had stopped. For the first time since the park, the air in the house was not managed. It was just still. 3 weeks later, Kale signed his name to a document. Not because he was told to, not because the alternative was worse, because Amari had asked him that morning, over the shape cereal in the warm kitchen, with Zion drawing something on the back of a grocery receipt. Are we staying? And Kale had looked at his sons, at the kitchen, at the cereal, at the grocery receipt covered in something that was either a horse or a building, and something in him had stopped holding on quite so hard. The document was 2 pages. Drayden had put it on the kitchen table 3 days after Holt left and said, when you're ready, or never, both work. Then he'd walked out and not mentioned it again. Kale had read it 14 times. Each time he'd put it back. On the 15th time he'd read it differently, not looking for the price, not scanning for the thing that would cost him later, just reading it. What it said was simple. Formal registration of residence. Legal guardianship confirmed for both children. His name attached to an address and a household and 3 men who had, for reasons that were still not fully explained, that still held edges he hadn't touched, decided that finding him in the snow meant something. He signed it. Set the pen down. Didn't feel dramatic about it. Just felt settled. Like a door he'd been standing in front of for 3 weeks had finally closed behind him. Not locked, just closed. The kind of closed that meant he was on the inside now. The public moment happened on a Tuesday. Not planned, not staged. They were at a pharmacy. Zion had an ear infection routine managed, and there was a wait, and Kale was standing in the middle of a busy aisle when 2 women at the end recognized him. He could tell from the shift in their posture, the whisper, the way one of them looked at him and then looked away with the specific studied nothing of someone filing a judgment. He'd felt that look his whole life. He waited for the familiar weight of it, waited for the shrinking. It didn't come. Not because it no longer existed, because Drayden was standing beside him, not doing anything, not speaking, not even looking at the women. Just standing beside Kale with his shoulder 3 inches from Kale's shoulder, completely present, like there was nowhere else in the building that made more sense for him to be. Cashin was in the next aisle. Romulo was at the counter. 3 men who did not look like they required anyone's approval standing in the same space as someone the world had spent years treating like a problem to walk around. The women didn't say anything. They moved down the aisle. And Kale stood there for a moment after they were gone. Something was different. Not the world was the same. The look still happened. The calculations still ran in other people's eyes. The particular casual cruelty of recognition and dismissal hadn't disappeared. But it had landed differently. It had landed on the surface and stayed there. For the first time in years, it hadn't gotten in. He looked sideways at Drayden. Drayden was reading the back of a vitamin bottle. Then he looked up, caught Cale watching, and held the bottle out. "Romulo thinks Zion needs vitamin D," he said. "I think that's not how ear infections work. You have a perspective." Cale took the bottle. "Read it," handed it back. And for the first time, standing in a fluorescent-lit pharmacy aisle on a Tuesday, something in his chest did a thing he wasn't entirely prepared for. He almost smiled. Not fully, but almost. Drayden looked at him and chose not to comment on it, which was somehow the exact right choice. That evening, all 5 of them were in the main sitting room. Nobody had planned it that way. Amari had dragged the wooden blocks out and was constructing something structural and ambitious on the floor. Zion was medicated, warm, half asleep on the couch with his ear infection draining into the treatment it didn't deserve to resist. Romulo was on the far couch reading something. Cashin was at the window. Drayden was in the chair across from Cale. No particular reason, just all 5 of them in the same room. Cale sat with his back against the couch, one hand resting near Zion's blanket, watching Amari build something that kept losing its top floor. He wasn't waiting for anything. That was new. He was just there, not calculating the exit, not reading the room for danger, not preparing for the version of this that ended badly. Just sitting in a warm room with his sons and 3 men who had done inexplicable things for reasons that were still not fully mapped, and finding that the silence between all 5 of them was comfortable, manageable, real. Amari's structure collapsed. He looked at it for a second, then looked up at Romulo. "I need a second opinion on my foundation," he said. Romulo turned a page. "Your foundation is too narrow for that height," he said. "Widen the base by 3 blocks on each side." Amari stared at him. "You weren't even looking." "I looked when you started." Amari looked back at his structure, started rebuilding from the bottom. Cale watched him, then looked at Drayden. Drayden was already looking at him, not with the studied, cataloging attention of the first weeks. Something had changed in it, had gone warmer than clinical, less measured, more like the way someone looks at a thing they're glad exists. Cale held his gaze for a moment, then looked back at Amari. "Dad?" Amari said, without looking up from his blocks. "Are we safe now?" The room didn't go quiet. Nobody shifted. Nobody looked up. But Cale felt the weight of the question in his chest, the way you feel a question that deserves an honest answer. He looked at Drayden one more time. Drayden looked back. Neither of them spoke. Cale looked at his son. His hands moved. "Safer than we've ever been." Amari considered that. Looked at his blocks. "That's not the same as safe," he said. "No," Cale signed. A pause. "Is it enough?" Cale looked around the room. At Zion asleep on the couch. At Romulo giving structural advice without being asked. At Cashin at the window watching the street, steady as always. At Drayden, who had sat on a step because it seemed like the right place to be. His hands moved. "For today." "Yes." Amari nodded. Rebuilt his foundation 3 blocks wider. The structure held this time. And in the hallway, just barely audible, one of the additional security staff Cale had started to recognize by footstep made a single pass. Everything quiet. Everything held. Then Cashin turned from the window. "There's a vehicle," he said. "3rd pass in 40 minutes. The room didn't change. But it changed. Drayden stood. Didn't look alarmed. Looked at Cale. And said, quiet, steady, looking at him like he was a person and not a position. Something that neither confirmed comfort nor canceled it. This was the easy part. If you've ever had to fight just to be seen as a person, this story was for you. If this moved you, Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And drop in the comments, what moment hit you hardest? Was it the park, the document, or that question Amari asked at the end? Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story on this channel. Every story here is about people who held on when everything said let go. You belong in this community. Tell us in the comments what kept you watching and what keeps you holding on.